welcome to another episode of Vantage Point. I'm Mahina Bongzo, joining you on the program after quite some time, but still very much excited to talk to our guest who's here today. As usual, Dr. Dayan Jayatilaka, a senior diplomat, a senior political analyst. Thank you very much for joining us on the show, Doctor.
Thank you, Mahina, and it's great to have you back.
Doctor, this whole week is going to be a milestone week.
Oh, yeah.
In the sense of the 100-day program, the people's expectations, how the government really tackles all these issues, the controversies, the allegations, and also at the end of it, getting its work done amidst all of these opposition and crying out loud. In the focus, in the center of all of this is a topic that has been in the cards for a very long time, and that is the 19th Amendment to the Constitution.
Yes.
Now, the very party or the very people that really spoke out for the 19th Amendment, the Jatika Helu Urume and Patali Champika Ranavaka, are now raising their voice about the draft of the 19th Amendment and how it is not conforming with the interests of everybody. And they're also openly accusing the Prime Minister of trying to take over the powers. What do you make of this very important party that made up this national government suddenly raising all these allegations at the last minute?
Well, Mahina, in the first place, yes, this week is going to be a wild ride. And Champika Ranavaka got one thing right, at least, when he said at a press conference the other day that this week is going to determine the destiny of Sri Lanka for the next decade. Actually, I would say that he was understating it. This week will, in some respects, determine the destiny of Sri Lanka for the next few decades, because it's to do with the basic law, the fundamental architecture of our political system. So it's the most important week we've had since January 8th, since the election, and arguably it's more important than January 8th, because an election is one thing, but a drastic change of the political environment through a constitutional change is something else.
Because at elections, the thing is, the politicians, they come out, they have manifestos which seem very glossy, they seem very promising, but when it comes really down to the work at hand, it's really a big deal. I mean, these are changes that you cannot
foresee overnight.
Deal. Yeah.
This is a much bigger deal. It should be treated with far greater circumspection and deliberation than it has been. Now, the JHU's criticism is correct, but then so is the UNP's defense. And so is what the Sri Lanka Freedom Party is saying, as well as the other opposition parties. How can everybody be right? The JHU says that, look, this is not the reform of the executive presidency. We promised to dump the surplus power of the executive presidency, but to retain a reformed, streamlined presidency. And they're right. The UNP says we promised to abolish the executive presidency. And in fact, this doesn't abolish it, but it takes away most of the executive powers and leaves a few powers in the hands of President Sirisena, but that's transitional. He's the last who's going to have this. And that's what we promised. And they are right as well. Now, how are they both right? They're both right because both promises were made, which is what I pointed out at the time. Hey guys, you're promising two different things at the same time. So this deadlock was foreseeable, it was foreseen,
so
and here we are.
And why didn't the politicians see this deadlock? I mean, were they all caught up in the thought of having a national government, about just focusing on toppling the previous regime? Why didn't they foresee this deadlock?
Well, they wanted to get everybody they could together, and instead of working on the identification of a common denominator, something that everybody could clearly agree to, a common program, which is the way politics is done, including in Sri Lanka. You have a common program. common platform. Instead of doing that, you had two different platforms which, like some of these digital stages, were brought together at one point. So now it's decomposing. And even within the cabinet, you do not have a consensus on something as fundamental as a major constitutional change. And then you've got the SLFP's critique. The SLFP says, look, there's a problem of procedure. What is in the Gazette is not what the 19th Amendment is about now, because there's a 12-page or 20-page supplementary document that was sneaked past without being gazetted. It was sent by the legal draftsman, and this was done by Prime Minister Wickremesinghe. So they're really talking about subterfuge. Champika Ranawaka echoes some of this, and he says there's a constitutional conspiracy. The UNP and the JVP and the TNA, which petitioned the courts, the JVP and TNA petitioned the courts, and the JVP leader, Mr. Dissanayake, criticized those who are criticizing Prime Minister Wickremesinghe and talk about strange bedfellows. The UNP, TNA, JVP Troika says, look, this is what we promised. And they're supported by Mr. Jayampati Wickramaratne, who was one of the two drafters of the 19th Amendment, the other one being Mr. Subandran. So, they are all correct because different things were said to different people at different times. But there is a problem of process. Because you can't do this. I mean, Mahina, this is a constitution. You cannot have one thing in the Gazette and then have amendments to that not gazetted and kind of slip through.
The President, as the head of government, is he unaware of these sort of, as you said, these different views that have been expressed about the draft of the 19th Amendment? I mean, his party, the SLFP, is raising concerns about the 19th Amendment.
Yeah.
What is the role of the President in all of this? Is he just a silent watcher?
Well, that's the $64,000 question. The President obviously was not happy about the UNP's 19th Amendment, which is why you had this punch-up on March 15th in the cabinet and then in the leadership, the party leaders meeting. And the President said, look, no, this is not what was said, and so on. And Prime Minister Wickremesinghe is reported as having said, I'm going to talk to Chandrika about this. This is what I was promised. So the cat was more or less out of the bag. I would suspect that Mr. Champika Ranawaka and the Sri Lanka Freedom Party would not be taking the stance that they're taking unless that stance is broadly congruent with what they understand to be the President's position. But whether that position will change, one doesn't know. It's because the country is being run really by a troika, and that's President Sirisena, former President Chandrika Kumaratunga, and Prime Minister Wickremesinghe. One doesn't know what the shifting balance of forces is among those three. So,
but in a troika, it is always you have two people versus one.
Exactly. So, really, it depends on what Chandrika will do. I mean, is she more loyal to Maitripala Sirisena? Or is she more loyal to Mr. Wickremesinghe, her newfound political partner in the great struggle to oust Mahinda Rajapaksa? So, I think she's in the middle here. Will she go with Maitri and the SLFP? And if she doesn't do so, there's always her bête noire, former President Rajapaksa, waiting to take that catch in her mind as well. Now, if she does that, well, she'll get brownie points from the SLFP, but what happens to the understanding that Prime Minister Wickremesinghe says that he has with President Kumaratunga? That all of this was worked out, and that she made certain promises to him. Now, we'll just have to wait and see. But
so this is all about the promises made to the people, promises made to one another, and also upholding those promises, which at the end of the day becomes the biggest challenge of all.
Well, there's been obviously a bit of political promiscuity here, of making different promises to different people at more or less the same time. And now you have these rival interpretations of those promises. But Mahina, two other things. One, what we have is a very dangerous situation, very close to what Thomas Hobbes, the great thinker and theoretician of the theory of social contract, described as the state of nature. When he spoke of a war of all against all. I mean, just look at the situation. You've got UNP versus JHU, JVP versus JHU. Then you really don't know what Mr. Rajitha Senaratna and those who came along with President Sirisena think. So the cabinet is split on a fundamental issue. The cabinet. So also the National Executive Council. And then you have the UNP versus the SLFP, which says, no, look, you're cheating on the procedure, and we also want electoral reform simultaneously. So it's everyone fighting everyone else, and I'm not even talking about the pro-Rajapaksa build-up, on the horizon. Now, everybody fighting everybody else is exactly what Thomas Hobbes described. He was talking about violent conflict, of a war of all against all. This is soft anarchy, Mahina. You cannot govern a country this way. You cannot develop a country this way.
But can we also look at it in this way, Doctor, where, I mean, as you said, this is a historic moment. Passing the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, it's a historic moment. Taking away certain powers from the executive presidency, which was the epitome of power in Sri Lanka's political arena when Jayawardene introduced the executive presidency. We are taking this big epitome of power and reducing it to something and sort of sharing that power amongst all, if you may say. But as you said, it's a big historic moment, and doesn't that require deliberation? Doesn't that require questioning and criticism and trying to find the best way possible, middle path?
But finally it needs consensus, at least in your cabinet. Now, it's like a patient on the operating table, and the surgeons can't agree what should be removed and what should not be removed. And what about the poor patient? It's as bad as that. You have Mr. Ranawaka saying, and I must say I tend to agree with him on this one. He says, look, you're taking away the powers of what you call an all-powerful president and making the Prime Minister all-powerful. How does that help? So you've got a situation which is very bad, as bad as it can get from the point of view of constitution making. Now there's a way out of this.
Before that, do you think this is rushed to a certain extent?
Absolutely.
As well?
I mean, there's this, why aren't they giving sufficient time for Parliament to debate it? Now the SRP says, look, you can't debate it this week with these amendments which have not been gazetted, which are 20 pages long. These are amendments to the amendment. This is on top of my point, which is that you don't have a constitutional amendment that's 70 pages. It's a new constitution, which you're disguising as an amendment. So, it's been rushed through. There is a fear of having to go for a referendum. Why? I mean, this is to do with the basic law. Why don't we ask the people what they think about the house that is being built?
So you are for a referendum?
Something as huge as shifting the center of gravity from an elected president to a prime minister, I mean, it's fundamental.
That is what is going on in the Supreme Court. The petitions that were filed.
That is what is going on.
With senior lawyers, political parties, all calling for a referendum.
And one of the UNP spokespersons has said that if the Supreme Court says that certain clauses require a referendum, they will be deleted from what comes to Parliament. Now, the problem there is that still won't get the UNP a two-thirds majority, because the Sri Lanka Freedom Party says we need those electoral reforms to guarantee stability. Now, their argument has a point, but I'm not fully convinced by the SLFP argument either, and we can talk about that if you like as we go on. But that's the reality. The SLFP says no electoral reform, no deal. Now, will Madam Kumaratunga come into class and rock the SLFP knuckles and say, no, never mind the electoral reform, you have to go along with the 19th Amendment? And will the SLFP do so? And if they do so, how many of them will defect to the Rajapaksa bandwagon? So, this is where things are, and none of it, Mahina, is necessary. There's an easy way of doing this.
And what is the easy way, Doctor?
Look, it's simple. Let's say a group of friends, all of you, when you were in school, if you want to go on an excursion, and there are 5 friends, 3 of you or 2 of you want to go only so far, and the others want to go much further. Now, either you can keep on haggling and not go anywhere, or you can force the group to go as far as possible, but then you lose 2 or 3 of your friends, or things will never be the same between you. Or you say, all right, there's something we all agreed on, we should at least go this far. All 5 of us agree to that. So this time, let's go that far, let's go to Kandy, and the next time, next semester or next year, let's go all the way to, Anuradhapura or Jaffna. So, there are things here in the 19th Amendment which everybody, the JHU, the SLFP, the JVP, everybody agrees to. It's the principle of the common denominator. Why don't they just do that now? Don't have this 70-page plus 20-page thing, which is, it's a bus, right? And you can't get that through. If you can't get it through your own cabinet, if there's dissension in your own cabinet, it's not going to have legitimacy even if you somehow get Chandrika to get the SLFP to rubber stamp it. So why not do what everybody has agreed upon? And what is that? That is the restoration with teeth of the 17th Amendment. So, and that's the abolition or the rolling back of the 18th Amendment. So you bring back your term limits for the presidency and restore the independent commissions, and that's good enough for now. And let's see how this works.
Make it a gradual process, is that what you're saying?
Make it gradual, test it out empirically. Here you have the Westminster model from 47 to 78. That's a good 30 years. Then you had another 35 years under the executive presidency, which is the US-French model. You have the British model earlier, the British and Indian model, then you have the US and French model. Now, a sane, sensible, logical, rational thing to do is to combine the strengths of the two. To look for a middle path. Not to go back to the Westminster model with just some residual powers, left over. Why these pendulum swings? So instead of the pendulum swing, which is contentious, which your own cabinet doesn't agree upon, why don't you do what everybody thinks is a good thing to do? Bring your independent commissions, have your term limits back for the presidency, and stop there. And then your cabinets can be friends again. And the SLFP will be on board because they're talking about electoral reforms. And without the SLFP, you can't get a 2/3. So say, yes, let's have electoral reforms. Mm-hmm. And if that takes a month or 3 months, take the 3 months and do it.
So do you think that there is a justification in what the SLFP is saying, that electoral reforms should be introduced and then the 19th Amendment take into effect?
Semi-justification. It's semi because they've got a point. The point is that when you weaken the executive presidency to the degree that the 19th Amendment envisages, you're going to have a problem of stability. Especially if you have the system of proportional representation. Because if you look at Israel, if you look at Italy, these are places with a prime ministerial system, but proportional representation, and the governments are dependent on the smaller parties. Coalitions tend to move like like a taximeter, they used to say in Italy. So the SLFP is saying, let's stabilize this by bringing in a mixed system which has been deliberated upon in Parliament for 6 years, the Dinesh Gunawardena Committee. So you don't have pure PR, pure proportional representation, and no executive presidency. I mean, that's the worst of all possible worlds. I agree there, and I do think that a mixed electoral system will lend some stability to the system. But the problem is this: when President Jayawardena brought in the presidential system in order to give the country stability for economic growth, what we had was a first past the post system. It was not a system of proportional representation. So you're going back more or less to a system which yielded instability. I mean, President Jayawardena was not fighting against the PR system. He brought in the PR system. These guys say that the PR system will make it more unstable, which is true, because once you knock the presidency off, the PR system is going to make it more unstable. But that is not where the problem is. I mean, you can bandage it with a system that is not PR. But the system that was pre-PR was the source of the instability which President Jayawardena wanted to liberate the country from. So what the SLFP is talking about is a palliative. It doesn't address the real problem, which is the excessive draining of powers from the elected executive president.
In your view, what do you think is the system that is best suited for a national government that we have today?
Well, I'm not convinced that the national government is a good thing, because as I've said in many places, just as the marketplace, the competition in the marketplace gives the best deal to the consumer, the competition in a two-party system is what gives the best deal to the citizen. Now, if you bring both parties together, there has to be a huge national emergency, such as a war, not just any war, but a huge war, world war kind of situation, or a huge natural disaster, a huge economic depression. And we don't have those situations, which warrant the suspension of the competition in the two-party system, which brings the best results for the citizen voter. So the national government is bad. This is not the time for national government. But if you ask me what's the best system, my answer has been look at the UN Security Council, the world's 5 top powers, 4 of which have executive presidencies, and only one of which is a parliamentary system, which is Britain. So I would say clearly it's the presidential system. But if the argument is that Sri Lanka's presidency is top-heavy, well, then you don't abolish the presidency, you don't download almost all the powers and lodge them in the Prime Minister. You don't say that the President has to act on the advice of the Prime Minister or to consult the Prime Minister and make it mandatory. What you do is you take a little time, not much time, and you do a comparative study of the presidential systems all over the world, especially the key liberal democratic countries, the United States, France, Brazil, South Africa, Mandela's constitution. And you see which parts of the Sri Lankan presidency have too much power. Basically, you're talking about an alteration, Mahina. That's what we should do. But the 19th Amendment is not an alteration. It's recutting the dress. And I think that's a bad thing to do.
Now, the 19th Amendment, I mean, the petitions are being heard at the Supreme Court, and the verdict is to be announced this week. Let's say the 19th Amendment does go into Parliament, it's taken up for debate. Do you think there's an easy passage for the 19th Amendment?
No.
Despite the dissidence in Parliament?
There is no easy passage. There is no easy passage. It's going to be turbulent, and as I said, it's needlessly turbulent. Instead of trying to force the whole thing down the throat of the Parliament, if they had broken it up into small, bite-sized chunks, starting with the restoration of the 17th Amendment and the abolition of the 18th Amendment, I mean, it would have gone through.
If it is passed in Parliament, how do you think would be the political future of Sri Lanka?
Well, from a systemic point of view, I'm very worried because, I mean, look at the process of decision making. The President has to consult the Prime Minister, and if the President says no, after 2 attempts, then it goes to Parliament. Then why bother to have a presidency? If the President has to consult Parliament in the final analysis, then you're back to pre-1978. Mr. Javadana's point from 1966 was that for economic development, you need a strong and stable executive, I'm quoting, free from the whims and fancies of the legislature, unquote. Now, his distant nephew, Mr. Wickremesinghe, is reversing that and making the nationally elected executive president captive to the whims and fancies of the legislature. I think it's a disaster for the country. It will affect economic development. Already you can see the situation with the economy without the 19th Amendment. And you will have a situation where if there's a perceived threat to national security, national sovereignty, the executive presidency won't be able to make a decision because he has to act on the advice of or in consultation with the Prime Minister. And if the PM says no, it has to go to Parliament. And how can you respond to the kind of situations that we have faced over the last 30 years? It's not possible. So on the economic development front and on every other front, national sovereignty, national security, we will not have a leader who can make decisions. And if the decision-making process is messed up in the way that the 19th Amendment plans to do, then you have a ship without an effective captain.
So this is your long-term picture of the 19th
Well, short term,
Amendment.
if it gets through, that's what's going to happen. And we are going to be in this mess any time from that day forth.
Okay. Now, moving away from the 19th Amendment in its whole, we also have certain amendments that actually have come about because of the executive presidency or stemming from that. And one such amendment is the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Now, I don't know whether you remember this, Doctor, but when we started Vantage Point, it was in August. And that was when the Northern Provincial Council elections were happening. And we were talking extensively about the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, about devolution of power, land powers, police powers. I mean, that was when our show began, 2 years ago. Now, coming to the present moment in time, we have the 13th Amendment still in the background. We have the Indian Prime Minister the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who arrived in Sri Lanka, saying 13th and beyond. How do you see the 13th Amendment to the Constitution fitting in to all of this in the current context?
A very important question, Mahina. Congratulations for asking that. Well, things have changed, haven't they? I mean, a few days ago, the BJP had its annual convention in Bangalore, it's now known as Bangalore. And it passed a resolution under the section on foreign policy. And the resolution congratulated Prime Minister Modi for being the first Indian Prime Minister to visit Jaffna. Fine. And went on to say that the Prime Minister advocated going beyond the 13th Amendment and spoke about federalism, quote unquote. This is the resolution, part of the resolution on foreign policy endorsed by the BJP in the annual session in Bangalore a few days ago. So that's what has happened. You've had the Prime Minister of a visiting giant power, which is not a disinterested or neutral observer because you have 70 million Tamils in Tamil Nadu, meaning you've got a huge vote bank there. And he comes over to Sri Lanka and says the kind of thing that most visiting prime ministers don't say when they visit their neighbors, which is, why don't you do this? We think, in our view, we think that you should go beyond the 13th Amendment and that federalism is a good thing. And the Chief Minister of the Northern Province, Mr. Vigneshwaran, says, well, we didn't like the 13th Amendment from 1987. Mr. Sambandhan, together with, under the leadership of Mr. Sivasidambaram and Mr. Amithalingam, wrote to Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in October 87 saying the 13th Amendment is no good, is not enough. And we are happy that you spoke about federalism in Colombo. Now he says that while welcoming Prime Minister Modi. And Mr. Vigneshwaran says, we think that the Northern Province should have the powers that a state has in India, which includes the powers over land, law and order, and internal security of the province, of the state in India. Now, that is where we are. It's very different from what used to be. Now, until the visit of Prime Minister Modi, India's policy was building on the 13th Amendment. They never said go beyond. And it was said at bilateral meetings with our leaders. Mainly President Rajapaksa, but also President Sirisena. These were bilaterals. Never in the Sri Lankan Parliament or the Sri Lankan people. And now Mr. Vigneshwaran, the Chief Minister, has not only passed a resolution, an 11-page resolution accusing every Sri Lankan government from 1948 of committing genocide against the Tamil people, which must be really the slowest and most inefficient genocide in human history. And then he hands this genocide resolution to two important UN officials. He gives it to Mr. Jeffrey Feltman, the highest ranking political officer of the UN, to visit Sri Lanka recently. And he gives it to Mr. Paolo de Grief, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Truth, Justice and Non-Recurrence, 2 days ago. So the 13th Amendment is jeopardized by those who want to move beyond it towards federalism and those who support and endorse that move. So there's a push on the 13th Amendment, pressure to supersede it. At the same time, you're lowering the roof that permitted the center to dominate the councils and to make sure that they didn't move, because there was always a danger that a northern council which is adjacent to Tamil Nadu can be drawn in, can be influenced, will strive to unite with that huge landmass with its 70 million core ethnics. This is natural. And they've already signaled that they're dissatisfied with the 13th Amendment. The controlling mechanism was always the executive presidency. The 13th Amendment was part of the presidential system. Mr. Jayawardena would never have agreed to many of those powers, except for the fact that he thought that the presidency was sufficiently powerful to grant those powers to the province. There is a reason that no Sri Lankan government gave such power to the provinces while there was only a parliamentary system, because it would have been too dangerous. And the Tamil people were unwilling to accept less, such as district council and so on. It is only once we had a strong, stable executive presidency that our leadership correctly thought that it's possible to transfer these powers. Now, if you download the powers of the presidency, so you shrink that, the capacity to control the North through the governor and by the executive presidency is diminished. Even if you say, oh no, the president will be running the provincial councils, and that's what the UNP says. I mean, you're going to cut the presidency down to size, and then you said, no, don't worry, he's still got the provincial councils as one of the portfolios. You're weakening the presidency, and then saying, no, he can manage it. He can, you tranquilize a man, and then say that he can still hang on to the leash at the other end of which is a pit bull. So, now I understand, I was always wondering, now I understand why Mr. Sumandaran was the co-drafter of the 19th Amendment, and why the TNA, instead of saying, well, let these guys, SLFP, UNP, fight this out, went to the Supreme Court as a petitioner and said that you don't need a referendum for the 19th Amendment to go through, because they're frightened that the people at large will shoot it down. And why do they need the 19th Amendment? Because they want to flatten, they want to weaken the executive presidency. Then the move towards federalism becomes easier. I mean, federalism is no bad thing in other parts of the world, but when you have 70 million co-ethnics across a few miles of water, then federalism is dangerous for a small island, which is what Dr. Colvin R. De Silva said in 1972, enshrining the unitary nature of our state in the Constitution. Now, the TNA has a vested interest because the ability to rein in the Northern Provincial Council will be that much less once the 19th Amendment goes through. So 13A after 19A is very different from 13A before 19A.
During our initial discussions, when we started off the show Vantage Point, and we were talking in the context of the Northern Provincial Council elections, I mean, you spoke about the importance of the devolution of power.
I support it.
And about police powers and also
not police powers.
And also land powers. And you also commended Vigneswaran being appointed as Chief Minister of the province.
Yeah, I mean, I thought he was a good guy because he's a...
Now there's a shift.
There is a shift, Mahina, because Mr. Vigneswaran changed. I thought here was a Supreme Court judge. I mean, an excellent choice. And what does he do? Before the election, I mean, the day before the election, Mr. Vigneswaran made a speech in Valvariture saying that Mr. Prabhakaran was a great hero. Now, he didn't have to. And then he was interviewed by a newspaper and he said, yes, I think he's like Kapatipola. Now, Kapatipola didn't go around murdering women and children. And he didn't try to separate the country. This was what Mr. Vigneswaran said. And after that, we know that he has kept saying that the 13th Amendment isn't enough. He passed the genocide resolution. So, I supported Mr. Vigneswaran and the implementation of the 13th Amendment. Not police powers. I thought that should be kept on ice. But and land powers should not go beyond the 13th Amendment. The reason that the relationship between the Rajapaksa administration and the TNA broke down was that the TNA was asking for land powers beyond the 13th Amendment, not even the 13th Amendment. During the negotiation in 2011, the TNA produced a piece of paper and it said that, now, under the 13th Amendment, state lands and inter-provincial irrigation schemes are under Colombo, the government. But all other lands are vested with the province. Now, I think that's a good thing. I'm for the land powers as per the 13th Amendment. But the TNA said that even when it comes to state land or inter-provincial irrigation schemes, any land in that area, the use of that land, but even by the president, I mean, if he says things that there's landlessness and therefore you have to have some project or something, he has to get permission from the chief minister to use state land. This was the TNA's negotiating position in 2011. And of course, Mahinda Rajapaksa being Mahinda Rajapaksa, it was easy for his hawks to punch the buttons and, make him say no. So, I remain a supporter of the 13th Amendment within the presidential system, within the strong executive presidency, which is it was the 13th Amendment to the 1978 Constitution. But when you change the framework of the 1978 Constitution, then of course I'm not for the 13th Amendment because it's very different. Your entire matrix changes.
And the context changes.
The entire structure changes. So the 13th Amendment is different now. It's like this table. If you flatten the whole floor, this has a different importance. So, I'm certainly not for going beyond the 13th Amendment. And certainly not for federalism. Because it is far too dangerous in our country, which is small, an island, next door to Tamil Nadu, with a history of incursion. Long history. You can't forget either your history or your geography. If there are two things you mustn't forget, it's your history and your geography.
Now, also the TNA has thrown its hat into the ring in terms of the opposition leader crisis.
Yes.
I mean, there was a lot of, debate about the opposition leader with the SLFP supporting Nimasiripala de Silva to continue as opposition leader, and then Mahajan Eksa Perumuna bringing in Dinesh Gunawardena to take up the position of opposition leader, claiming that Nimasiripala de Silva holds a ministerial portfolio and therefore he cannot also hold opposition leadership. And then we see R. Sambandhan of TNA throwing his hat into the ring, saying, look here, we are now the largest independent political party in Parliament because the SLFP and the UPFA to a certain extent was a partner in bringing in this government. So therefore, we should be the opposition, the main opposition in Parliament. Now I read an article that you've written about Sambandhan's claim to opposition leadership and how you've said that it might not be really the healthy thing to do, take into account the statements that's been made by Sambandhan and his background. Just talk to me a little bit about this, Doctor. What really sort of triggered that sort of notion of thinking in you that Sambandhan is not really fit for this job, or the TNA is not really fit for the claim?
Well, I admire Mr. Sambandhan as a parliamentarian. He's a very cultured man, a fine speaker, a very decent gentleman. And it's a pity that there's only one Mr. Sambandhan in the Sri Lankan Parliament. So, it's not because of any personal attributes that I think he's not fit for the job of the leader of the opposition. Nor is it because he's an ethnic Tamil. And it's certainly not because he's the head of the TNA. For instance, if Dr. Neelan Tiruchelvam were alive, I'd be writing articles saying, let's make Neelan the leader of the opposition. But Mr. Sambandhan politically isn't Dr. Neelan Tiruchelvam. 3 years ago, I'm not even going to talk about what happened during the election of 2004, when Mr. Sambandhan led his party into the election on the sole platform that the LTT was the legitimate representative of the Tamil people. Let's say the Tigers were around at the time, and they would have killed him if he didn't do exactly as they told him to. So let's leave that aside. But 3 years ago, that's 3 years after the war was over, and Mr. Prabhakaran joined his honourable ancestors. Mr. Sambandhan made a speech, not just a platform speech, his official address to the annual convention of the party that he leads, the Ilangai Tamil Arasu Katchi. He made this speech in Battikal. So, official occasion, annual convention of the party. Party leader makes his address to the ITAC convention 3 years ago. What does he say? In that, he says, our aims and ambitions have not changed. Our methods have changed. Our tactics have changed. We are still for the same soaring ambitions that we could not achieve through armed force. Now, Mahina, what are the soaring ambitions that could not be achieved through armed force? devolution? I don't think so. The only soaring ambition that couldn't be achieved through armed forces is a Tamil. That's what armed force was wielded for. But he says our ambitions haven't changed. It's the same soaring aspiration, the same soaring ambition. Our aims are the same, our tactics have changed. And then he goes on to say, in case one thinks I'm making a mountain out of a molehill, he goes on to say, it is our responsibility to prove to the international community that Tamil rights cannot be obtained within a united Sri Lanka. He doesn't say unitary. Within a united Sri Lanka. And that we have to prove this to the international community. Now, I'm so sorry, but I'm not convinced that if he's made the leader of the opposition, he will not do what he says. I don't think Mr. Sambandhan is a liar. I think he's telling the truth. That's my problem.
But, Doctor, in this context, we have this tug of war in the opposition. And don't you believe, as a political analyst, that Sambandhan has a rightful claim to it?
No.
Because Dinesh Gunawardena comes from the UPF. It's part of the SLFP. SLFP is part of the national government. So, as you said, we need, an opposition. We need a government.
Yes.
Opposition should be independent from government. So, don't you think he has a rightful claim? He has a majority of seats in terms of an opposition.
Well, Mr. Sambandhan, I believe, is disqualified on two grounds. One is, he doesn't oppose the government, he's a member of the National Executive Council. Now he says he's willing to resign in order to get this post, but he is a member of the National Executive Council, he has no problem with the government. So, what's he going to oppose? And the second thing is, what he stands opposed to is not the government, he stands opposed to the Sri Lankan state. This is in his speech 3 years ago to his own party.
Are we pinning this on suspicion? Are we pinning this on a matter of trust?
No, how can you trust somebody? How can you trust somebody who has addressed his party convention? Either we have to trust him or they have to trust him. And if they trust him, they have to trust what he has said. I trust what Mr. Sambandhan told his party at an official occasion, not in his election speech trying to get some votes, but in his written address. It was a written text. When he says, our soaring ambitions are the same as those we couldn't achieve with armed force, they have not changed, our aims haven't changed, only our tactics have changed, and it is our responsibility to prove to the international community that Tamil rights cannot be obtained within a united Sri Lanka. Now he'll try to prove it as leader of the opposition. You can't have a leader of the opposition who doesn't agree with the fundamental framework, who is not loyal to the Sri Lankan state. Now, as for the rest of it, that is Dinesh Gunawardena, Nimal Siripala de Silva, you can't have a party which is a governing party. The SLFP is now a party in government, which is also the opposition. It's not possible. It's logically impossible. Now, at least for Mr. Gunawardena, he is not a member of the SLFP. He is the leader of the MEP, which is not a party in coalition with the UNP. So he is not part of the government. Therefore, he is eligible to lead the opposition. And secondly, from what we have heard, he has 60 signatures or affidavits, which would mean over 50 Sri Lanka Freedom Party MPs.
But doesn't he come into the SLFP fold as a main constituent party?
No, the SLFP is a constituent party of the UPFA, which is an umbrella organization. Mr. Gunawardena is not a member of the SLFP. He is a member of the MEP, which is under the UPFA umbrella. But the UPFA is not a constituent member of the government. It is only the SLFP that is. Not the UPFA. So, that's my reckoning. I don't know what the Speaker's ruling will be at this point of time, of course.
Doctor, in conclusion, President Maithripala Sirisena was in Pakistan on a 3-day official visit. He's been visiting a lot of different states, trying to further Sri Lanka's relationship with key states in Sri Lanka's geopolitical arena. But in this backdrop, we also see a recalling of foreign missions. Over 20 foreign missions have been recalled to Sri Lanka. So how do you think Sri Lanka is going to further its relationships without any appointments made to certain countries where there are no head of diplomatic missions?
Well, I think that's only the tip of the iceberg. There's a far more serious problem here. That is that you have two different foreign policy perspectives, which sometimes coincide, but these are two different directions. There's President Sirisena, who is going in more or less the traditional SLFP direction, and that's a good thing, which is prioritizing Asia. And then you have Mr. Samaravira and his pro-Western approach. Now, this is most starkly obvious in the attitude towards China. Mr. Sirisena and those who came from the SLFP and the JHU and so on, they've never said anything to embarrass the Chinese. But the UNP government has been going hammer and tongs at China, which is a very important, probably, a very important economic player, not just for Sri Lanka, but for the world. I mean, the British kind of ran in order just to make the deadline to join the new Chinese bank, leaving the Americans out. The Americans are unhappy about it, but even Britain crept in there. So the UNP is bashing the Chinese. When President Sirisena was in China, Minister of Finance Ravi Karuranayake gave an interview which contradicted something that the Chinese said. So, let me be very frank. I think that there's going to be a foreign policy problem, just as there's a problem over the 19th Amendment. And I think that President Sirisena has other cards to play, whether he's aware of it or not. Frankly, within his cabinet today, I'm not even talking about the pro-Rajapaksa element, radicals or progressives or whatever. I'm talking about the present cabinet. I think Mr. Sirisena has at least two people in his cabinet who would be better foreign ministers than the present one, and far more in keeping with President Sirisena's own thinking. And one is Dr. Sarath Amunagama. I mean, he's a brilliant guy, he's a scholar and so on. And the other is Mahinda Samarasinghe, who can do what Mangala is doing, but do it with a greater sensitivity to President Sirisena's own orientation.
Doctor, just briefly answer my question about the diplomatic missions and how important it is to have people.
I deliberately stayed away from that. I'm a former head of 2 missions, so
that's why I asked you, because you are familiar with how the diplomatic network
I mean, look,
works.
it's bad to have headless missions. It doesn't look good, but that's a question I'd rather leave aside.
Okay, Doctor.
If you don't mind.
Thank you very much. That is very unnatural of you, because you usually answer all my questions, but
when it comes to, for instance, the current representation in Geneva or whatever the current ambassador said anywhere, I don't comment, because I'm a former ambassador. So there are certain things that I don't...
Very diplomatic. Thank you very much, Dr. Dayan Jayathick, for joining us on Vantage Point, and everyone watching us at home. As we spoke about, this week is a historic week, and we'll be joining you in a fortnight with insights and views, and also with the latest that's happening in the political arena, coupled with what's happened during this week. Thank you again for joining us. You can watch us. Our YouTube videos are up on our Newsfirst website. That's www.newsfirst.lk. You can follow us on Twitter and also on Facebook and also on our YouTube channel. Thank you very much for joining us. Good night.
Thank you, Mahi. Good night.